Research Program Coordinator at the Center for Policy Analysis and Research for the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. I am pleased to welcome you to the 50th Annual Legislative Conference. This year, we are featuring a session on the Journal of the Center for Policy and Research, JCPAR, entitled Re-envisioning Liberation for the Global Black Diaspora. This session delves into JCPAR policy objectives and research. We will cover topics in modern Black movements, global health equity, structural racism, as well as methods to uplift the Black diaspora. Before we jump in, I'd like to first introduce Congresswoman Stacey Plaskett from the Virgin Islands. The Congresswoman is a champion for the people and serves on the House Committee on Ways and Means. In true historic fashion, Ms. Plaskett is the first member from a U.S. territory and the fourth African-American woman to serve on this committee. These experiences make the insight she will bring to today's session even more important and timely. We are quite fortunate to benefit from her perspective this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Congresswoman Stacey Plaskett.
Greetings, I'm Congresswoman Stacey Plaskett, and I'd like to thank the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation for inviting me to provide greetings for the annual Legislative Conference Journal of the Center for Policy and Research session on Re-envisioning Liberation for the Global Black Diaspora. I would like to welcome our panelists, Dr. Julian Malveaux, Dr. Jamita Barlow, Dr. Michelle Morris, and Dr. Brooke Cunningham. I am positive that there will be a wealth of thought-provoking information. Before I begin, I would like to congratulate the present and former members of the Congressional Black Caucus on celebrating 50 years of being the conscience of the Congress. As we commemorate 50 years as a caucus, it is important that we pause and give thought to social, economic, and political status of Blacks and people of color nationally and globally. The events of the past 2 years, beginning with the global pandemic, social unrest, and the political insurrection, indicate that although we have come a long way from 50 years ago, we still have a long way to go, and that these issues are not unique to the United States, but affect the global diaspora. Our liberation from inequalities should not be addressed or approached in a silo, but in a collective, global manner. In the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. The African diaspora is a term coined in the 1990s that explains how Black people were enslaved from Africa and displaced in over 15 different areas across the globe, including Brazil, the United States, and Haiti between the 1500s and the 1900s, extending Blackness throughout the world and many nations. This displacement created an intersection of Black people and Native people, which has aided in the failed understanding of our collectiveness. Unfortunately, global anti-Blackness has lent a hand in this failed understanding of how Blacks view other Blacks with unshared ethnicity and cultures, pitting us against one another as foreigners, erasing our shared origin of existence. As African Americans, our plight is hard and often vacuumed into the issues we have been fighting against in America for 400 plus years, leaving us little room for concern for people we have always been taught to treat as different from us. The COVID-19 pandemic magnified the health disparities that are prevalent among Blacks and people of color. The COVID pandemic affected everyone, but research increasingly showed that it disproportionately affected Black people. Hospitalization rates among non-Hispanic Black and Hispanic or Latino peoples were both about 4.7 times the rate of non-Hispanic white people. COVID-19 and the lack of vaccination has disproportionately impacted the Caribbean nations. This is particularly difficult on their economies, which are primarily reliant on tourism. Most recently, in the British Virgin Islands, neighbor to my district, the US Virgin Islands, the CDC issued a level 4 COVID-19 advisory for those islands. COVID is not the only pandemic facing Black people in the US. Between January 1st and July 14th, 2021, at least 18 states enacted 30 laws that restrict access to vote. These laws make mail voting and early voting more difficult, impose harsher voter ID requirements, and make faulty voter purges more likely, among other negative voter consequences. More than 400 bills with provisions that restrict voting access have been introduced in 49 states in the 2021 legislative sessions. Despite the Black Lives Matter protests throughout the world, police brutality persists. About 1,000 civilians are killed each year by law enforcement officers in the United States. Globally, we have witnessed how violence can disrupt the political, social, and economic stability in a country. In Haiti, a nation whose very fight for independence was an affront to Europe, Forbes magazine wrote, for the crime of shaking off the yoke of involuntary servitude, Haiti dutifully paid France reparations over the course of nearly 6 generations with interest. That amount is $21 billion in today's money. That financial instability has caused tremendous political instability. The recent assassination of Haitian President Jovenel Moïse, the first in over 100 years, has violently disrupted an already fragile country that has been plagued by instability since that fight for independence. In 2018, it came to light that Black British subjects, known as the Windruff generation, descendants of people encouraged to come and work in the UK after World War II, from 1948 to 1971, from Caribbean countries on the MV Empire Windruff ship, had been threatened with deportation from the United Kingdom government, a government that seemed to believe its citizens of Black Caribbean origin were discardable. Let's not forget how Black Pete, Black-faced white folk in the Netherlands, depict St. Nick's helper to usher in Christmas time. Remember that Netherlands gave us Dutch Afrikaner system in South Africa. These examples barely scratch the surface on how social, political, and economic disparities are impacting the greater diaspora and require that we re-envision how we as political leaders and citizens address these issues in broader contexts. All of these recent events, more necessary than we as Black folk begin understanding our shared origins and our shared fight. We cannot allow the times to divide us or allow ourselves to be marginalized or fractured like groups such as ADOS, American Descendants of Slavery, which would have us believe that we are isolated in our history, our struggle, or in our collective power. Since its establishment in 1971, the Congressional Black Caucus has committed to using the full constitutional power, statutory authority, and financial resources of the federal government to address inequities in African American communities and other marginalized communities in the United States and globally. The CBC has fought for the past 50 years to empower these citizens and address their legislative concerns by pursuing a policy agenda that includes reforming criminal justice system, eliminating barriers to entry, combating voter suppression, expanding access to world-class education, expanding access to quality, affordable healthcare, eliminating racial health disparities, expanding access to 21st century technologies, promoting US foreign policy initiatives in the Caribbean, Africa, other countries that are consistent with fundamental rights of human dignity. The CBC has done that and continues to work on an agenda for our community, our entire community. For the 117th Congress, the CBC has a historic 56 members of the US House of Representatives and US Senate, representing more than 82 million Americans, 25.3% of the total US population, and more than 17 million African Americans, 41% of the US African American population. In addition, the CBC represents almost a fourth of the House Democratic Caucus. We are using our individual and collective power to bear in decision-making, vote counting, and policy decisions. The CBC is engaged at the highest levels of Congress with members who serve in House leadership. Representative James Clyburn as Majority Whip in the House, Representative Hakeem Jeffries serving as Chairman of House Democratic Caucus, Representative Barbara Lee as Co-Chair of the House Democratic Steering and Policy Committee. CBC members serve as chairs, 5 on full House committees, and 28 CBC members serve as chairs of House subcommittees. Collectively, we are working together and using our positions to reimagine how we create policies to address the inequities that persist, not only in America, but throughout the Black diaspora. The CBC ensured that our communities benefited in the the American Recovery Act for the EITC and CTC. The Earned Income Tax Credit will help an estimated 8 million Black households. The Center for Budget and Policy Priorities say that the child tax credit will cut the number of Black children in poverty by 52%, almost double the percent of white children. The CBC pushed the administration to ensure the US sent needed vaccines and support to the Caribbean. And presently, the CBC is working behind the scenes to ensure that the Build Back Better plan has specific provisions to support our communities, that what happened in the past, such as the GI Bill, that neglected to include Black Americans, does not happen in this once-in-a-generation legislation. I am confident that we will all be enlightened by the discussion today, and our awareness will be broadened so that we can be a global community that understands our shared inequities and works to fight them. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the session.
Thank you, Congresswoman Plaskett, for your remarks. I know this group will work tirelessly to identify and address major issues impacting the Black diaspora and discuss policy suggestions posed in their research. Now it is my honor to introduce our moderator for this session, the JCPAR Editor-in-Chief, Dr. Ivory Toldson. Dr. Toldson is a world-renowned scholar and author of No BS, No Bad Stats, a book that challenges conventional beliefs about educating Black children. Dr. Toldson has also recently accepted a new role as the Director of Education Innovation Research at the NAACP. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ivory Toldson.
Thank you so much, Desiree, for this introduction, and thank you to all of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation staff and leadership for continuing this amazing journal. I was invited to be the editor-in-chief of the Journal of CPAR. I think it was about 4 years ago now. And the vision of the previous Vice President, Minna, was to have a journal where Black academics could produce research that had the potential to elevate conversation to the highest offices of the land, in this case, in the halls of Congress. I remember the first publication that we finished, we had a briefing on Capitol Hill, and there was an author from CUNY University, that's City College of New York, and she traveled down and came to the release, and she said this was her first academic publication. And my response to her was, your first academic publication got you to the halls of Congress. And that's really what this is about. It's about us having research that doesn't just circulate in the ivory tower, but where we could really talk about the things that matter to us and position it to be able to influence policy. So I'm so honored to have this role. Our current issue, Africa, America, Liberation for the Black Global Diaspora, hits on a lot of very important topics. And I'm honored today to have one of our authors, Dr. Re-envisioning, who wrote a dynamic article about the changing demographics and policy reflections, and looked specifically at Boston, looked at historic and foreign African-American Blacks in Boston. We also have today our newly minted Dr. Patrice Johnson, who's the Vice President of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, Vice President for Research. And I was so delighted when she came on and took this journal and said, I not only want to continue it, but I want to elevate it. So we're very excited to have this conversation. Both of our panelists, I'd like you to say a few words about yourself and your work before we get into some questions. So why don't we start with you, Rita?
Thank you, Dr. Tolson. First, I like to be called Kiki, my middle name. It's also my African name, my Nigerian name. It's an abbreviation of my name in Kiru. So I go by Kiki. Well, thank you. By way of introduction, I am Kiki Edozie. I am a professor of international relations at UMass Boston, but I'm also the interim dean of a really great policy school. It's called the John W. McCormack Policy School of Global Studies and Policy, and it's at UMass Boston. I came across your journal 2 years ago, I think 2.5 years ago. My colleague and I, and her name is Barbara Lewis, because she was also a co-author on the article. We had just completed research on changing demographics in Boston, and we were looking at the diversity of the Black population in Boston City, and it was just fascinating. She is what we call a historic African American, and I am a immigrant African American. And we had some really great dialogues, and we decided to, put our minds together and do some research. So when your edition, your call for proposals and articles came out 2.5 years ago, I think, it was fascinating. You were looking at the same questions that we were looking at in the microscopic Greater Boston region. So we titled our article, Changing Demographics and Policy Reflections. That was also a really important dimension of contributing to your journal, because policy is at the end and all of everything that I certainly do in my work. So yeah, that's how we got here. I'll be happy to talk a little bit about the article later on, but why don't we give my former student, Dr. Patrice Johnson, a chance to talk about herself.
I so appreciate that. Yes, so I was absolutely trained by Dr. Edozie, and I appreciate the experience I had at James Madison, one of the best public policy schools in the country, which is probably why I've landed here to work with CBCF and continue policy work. But I am excited about the journal and what Minna's initial vision was to continue that vision. My role as VP for the Center for Policy Analysis and Research and Leadership Institute is essentially to make research accessible to the everyday person. And with this journal, I think we tackled some very complex issues, but at the heart of it, we're looking at exploring areas of policy that will support the global Black community at large. So the journal has a wide variety of content. We looked at lynchings, real and imagined, right? We looked at Dr. Tolson's piece around just the historical context of where we are as a global Black community, and essentially the goal is always to advance an agenda that is going to support the Black community in areas of economic development and education and pursuing equity, right? And I think that that's a long journey. However, the research and having scholars that look like us do the work is critically important. And then to have CBCF, share this work with members of Congress and folks at large in the policy space, as Dr. Tolson mentioned in the very beginning, that this work can in fact reach the halls of Congress and then hopefully reach the halls of change, right? That we will see the scholarship that we are committing to be reflected in policy change. So, essentially that's the goal and that's the work. One, that it's accessible, that my grandmother can read this scholarship and she can apply it, that we can kind of get out of the ivory tower and get into grassroots communities and start looking at change and what does that look like on the ground. So I'm excited, and I'm excited about our global front, right? And this is why Dr. Edozie's work is so important and why we're looking at, again, this global perspective of how do we have this connection, not just about the Black American, but from a global standpoint, how are we making headway from an equitable standpoint? So I'm excited. And Dr. Tolson, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So Kiki, we have something in common. We both have Nigerian middle names. My middle name is Achebe.
Igbo.
Igbo, yeah, Igbo. Yeah, my parents were reading Chinua Achebe's book Things Fall Apart when I was born.
Fantastic.
And so I have my father's first name, which is Ivory, and he instead of giving me his middle name Lee, he gave me
Oh,
Achebe.
wow.
I think Achebe is so much cooler than Lee. So thanks, Dad.
Great connection.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
great to have him on that. And the word diaspora is so powerful. And I remember first being introduced to that word in college. I took a class called studying the Black diaspora, and so I didn't know what it meant when I took the class, but I knew it had something to do with Black folks, and I wanted to take it. And it was a class that really taught me a lot, and it taught me about African retentions. And it taught about, it helped me understand why Black people in America are different, why we have soul, why we express our emotions certain ways, why we have elevated response to certain things, why we have rhythm, all these types of things. And I went to Africa, to Senegal, around that same time. And so everything connecting was just very powerful for me. As a college student, as an undergraduate student. Today, diaspora is something, it's probably still not, common lingo. It's probably still something that people associate with something that you learn in higher education, not K through 12. But yet at the same time, the Black race in America has become so much more diverse than it was back then. We have a much larger immigrant population. We also have these technological devices that allow us to communicate across continents with ease. So I want you to talk a little bit about the relationship that you had with your co-author in doing this, and what can we learn as Black Americans, both diasporian and Native, those with Native origins. What can we learn about how to work effectively with each other, because we have, such common struggles?
What a fascinating question. Let me start with, following you on your, the importance, of the concept diaspora, and especially the importance of the concept to the African-American lived experience. Some of the conversations I had with my colleague were that the African-American experience is a local experience. And I challenged her and said, no, it's a global experience. And she said, no, what she means is, it's a Bostonian. I mean, she's a native Bostonian. And I said, yes, but your heritage, gives you that, that's what diaspora means. It's the heritage which makes you ontologically or structurally diasporic and global, right? It's because it's those heritages that gives you the desire to connect, to, other worlds, and especially in Africa, trying to understand your African roots, but not just to Africa. But, what inspired us was Kamala Harris. We've already had this discussion with Barack Obama, 14 years ago when he, came to the fore. Is he Black, or is he, mixed, or is he half Kenyan, or is he Kenyan at all? It was surprising that when Kamala Harris also came to the fore, there were questions about her Blackness because, her father was Jamaican and her mother Indian. And so again, we had to underscore the notion of diaspority in the one hand, but also Black diaspority in the other, right? And she, in the way she embodies, Blackness so confidently and authentically and unapologetically, it also inspired us to, share that message through our study in Boston. I had lived in Michigan, for all these years with Patrice at Michigan State University. And, our favorite city, of course, was Detroit. And even before that, I call myself a Black New Yorker, a Black immigrant New Yorker, because I came to the United States in 1986. I just sort of embedded myself into the city of Brooklyn and Harlem, and just became a Black international. But coming to Boston, I was shocked, and this was just 4 years ago. I was shocked at the diversity of Blackness here. It was sort of very in your face. I would hear Black people speaking Portuguese. I would hear Black people speaking French. And this, shook me. I would even hear Black people speaking Igbo, which is my heritage language. I would go to the store, and this is your normal Stop and Shop. They would have an African aisle for foodstuffs. This was amazing. Even New York City, I had not seen this, not in the major stores. And so as I began to live here, I began to learn about the Cape Verde. I began to learn about the Haitian American population here. I began to learn about the Caribbean population, especially Jamaican communities, and even my own Native Nigerian communities in a significant way. So this inspired the study with my colleague, Barbara, who said, let us try to understand the changing demographics of Blackness in Boston and Greater Boston. I mean, the statistics were telling us that Roxbury, where I am living now, is sort of the home of Black culture, right? We used to, Black people, used to sort of dominate, the region, but recently there has been gentrification, and the Black population has been declining, but has been increasing in cities in surrounding Boston, like Brockton. So we chose these two cities, Roxbury and Brockton, and decided to examine the changing face of Blackness in these two cities. And we really had some really interesting findings on the one hand, but especially policy implications on the other.
Yeah, that's amazing. One of the great things that I thought this article captured was the beauty and the diversity of Black people, using Boston as a test case. And just like you had that experience with Boston, I think people can go all over the nation and find some diversity that they didn't know existed. So you captured that very well. Patrice, you talked about a lot of other aspects of the journal, including lynching. And I just recently, I'm not sure if you saw the movie on Billie Holiday, where the FBI was after her, something crazy, because of the book Strange Fruit. And J. Edgar Hoover and company, they harassed her and spied on her and just did all types of things because they didn't want this ugly part of American society to be exposed, and she was exposing it in the poetry of her music in a way that was really moving people. Um, the movie at the end of it talked about how the anti-lynching bills did not pass Congress back then. And even as recently as I think a couple of years ago, it was reintroduced and it couldn't get through Congress. I know in this current issue, it does touch on that ugly history and what we've learned from it. Just want you to give your reaction or your response to reading that in this journal.
Sure. I love that you brought up the Billie Holiday film, because I did watch it, and I will tell you it parallels to the same point of the piece in the journal, but it parallels to them not wanting to hear a song about the ugly truth of American history to today in 2021, the criticism around the 1619 Project and critical race theory, and really the idea of not sharing the truth in an education space with our young people, right? To the book, The Lies My Teacher Told Me, right? That we want to portray our nation as though it is a nation that was the underdog and won. And it was a beautiful experience when you have Frederick Douglass, who says you celebrate 4th of July as this amazing victory, and yet you are still enslaving people, right? So the parallels of keeping the truth hidden is still very real. The same as the parallel with the lynching bill not being passed then, and 50 some years later, it's still not being passed. And the reality that is the cultural experience that we have in America, that we are not addressing our past, right? And so I think this piece it recognizes, she talks about this real and imagined space, right? And we talk about that right under a year after George Floyd, where we could very, very honestly perceive his murder as a public display of a real lynching, right? And then the response to that is a very similar response to what we imagined and what we saw in the 50s with Emmett Till, right? So these parallels that we have not really shifted from a cultural standpoint, and the tactics that were very real 50 years ago are the same tactics that are happening right now. The only thing that I think has not changed is us having a little bit more of a tenable response to these matters, right? That policy has not changed, and yet we have the scholarship to guide us and the policy reflections, but members of Congress and legislative leaders have not taken ownership of the items that really matter to us, like passing the George Floyd Policing Act, and passing this new form of voter rights protection, as opposed to what we're seeing is that voting rights are now being stripped across the country. So I think that piece just makes me think about these parallels between the past and the present, almost as though the cycle continues to repeat itself. You're on mute, Dr. Tolston.
Sorry. Yeah, it's so much, and it can get pretty weighty. And you're right. There are so many things that we need right now. So many actions that we need from Congress. And I know that there was some criticism, and I believe this was fair criticism about this huge support that across both houses of Congress of passing the Juneteenth holiday. So some of the same congressmen and congresswomen who are supporting these anti-critical race theory bills are saying, okay, well, let's have a holiday for Juneteenth. But the Black community needs a lot more, and so there may be some people watching us and asking, why are we trying to even advance it at the policy level? So there's research that we're doing, and we think that this research can capture some aspect of Congress and maybe incorporate it into policy. What about the people who are kind of giving up and thinking that this stuff just won't happen at the policy level?
Well, I will tell you, and then I'd be really glad to see what Dr. Edozie has to say. But I will take a pin from critical race theory, the father of critical race theory, and Derek Bell. And in one of his pieces, he argues from a racial realism standpoint, which is one of the tenets of CRT, right? He's saying, look, you just got to keep trying to push uphill, but I don't think you're going to get there. He's just very transparent in saying, I don't think you're going to get there. I don't think you're going to get to that equitable space. However, the joy is in trying to get to that place, right? So it was a very daunting thing for someone like me to read, him saying, look, you can keep at it, but his argument was that racial realism is that racism continues. It just, over time, it just continues to manifest itself. It is a part of our structural reality. And the best you can do is keep trying to chisel at it, right? And as you chisel at it, the joy comes in the fight. And so I think that for those who are discouraged, we have to take hope in young people, right? And the folks that from CBCF we're putting on the Hill as interns, and they believe that there is change and hope, that they are still optimistic about that, right? So as we might be a little bit tired of hitting the mark, there is another generation that comes up and says, well, I can take this and continue to move forward, right? You look at the way that social media has changed social justice and activism, right? That young people, it's more accessible for them to begin engaging in social activism. So I think that, my response is the same thing that Bell would say, is the joy is in keeping at it.
Yeah, I agree. It's and we have to approach this from so many different levels. And as you mentioned, or as Desiree mentioned, I just joined the NAACP, and I know back during that time, the NAACP had an anti-lynching campaign, and they used to have on their headquarters, a man was lynched yesterday, and they continue to put that sign up. And so there's a lot of fight, and even though the legislation didn't pass Congress then and is not passing Congress now, that fight, as you said, that fight is a part of the larger struggle. It's a part of capturing people's imagination, helping people to see a better way forward, and also letting the people know who are doing these horrible things to Black people, that Black people are fighting on many different levels, whether it be at the grassroots level or at the policy level. Rita, did you want to say anything about?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's such a fascinating subject. And I think that Patrice has it dead on. It's the struggle. And, actually the paradox of the fact that in 2021, that there is an onslaught on critical race theory. For goodness sake, I'm really shocked, but not shocked. By this onslaught on critical race theory. But of course, it is because of the contradictions of the last, 10 years, and at least the last 4 years in our politics, that this is happening. It's the struggle is working, right? We are sort of engaging politically and getting access to power, and there is this backlash. of white nationalism. Hillary Clinton called it during her election. There's a swath of the country that is trying to hold on to this, old, entitled supremacy. Joe Biden, the president, actually also called it on it's white supremacy, and he wants to eliminate it. And so this is the backlash, right? But I want to go back to the questions about policy, and should we, push, the policy? We have to, of course, but we not getting what we want, at least in Nancy Pelosi's Congress. We haven't got the George Floyd bill passed. We don't have the John Lewis voting rights bill passed. I mean, this is atrocious, but we've got infrastructure. Okay, I think we need to get access to politics. And I am so excited about 2 mayoral races. One, New York City, I won't talk much about because it's sort of over, but right here in Boston, we've never had a mayor of color. How much more a Black mayor? Never. When I came to Boston 4 years ago, we're talking about, this is a segregated city and that's the way it is. Okay, when I ask questions about why is this way? Why is that? Oh, this is a segregated city. This is different. This is Boston. And 4 years later, we have 5 major mayoral candidates who are all of color, and 3 are Black, and 1 is foreign Black. John Barris is Cape Verdean, so he identifies as both Black and Cape Verdean. And 1 is immigrant woman, Anissa George. But 5 of them all claim to be candidates of color. 4 are women. And so it's access to power. We need them to get access to power and then sort of push policy that way. And that's what's happening, nationally as well, right? It's that access to power, the Georgia vote, when we got, that all of a sudden, the white backlash is against that, but we've got to continue to get access to power so that we can push our policy interests.
Yeah. And I think, related to that, the diversification of the candidates, just last week, the new census report came out, so we have the results of the 2020 census and the changes that's happened just in the last 10 years, from the 2010 since the 2020 census. It's remarkable. And this diverse nation, this majority, what used to be minority nation is happening faster than initially projected. And there is this, white nationalism, as you said, that's happening as a result of that. There's also increased racial awareness and, a reckoning. And, a lot of the things that we see in terms of, Black people, asking for critical race theory. Now, I know that critical race theory, probably the way it came out was more so others looking for a boogeyman. But, once people who were aware started to see what critical race theory was about, they said, yeah, this is how we should learn. And then also, topic of reparations, which is, something that I think a lot of people have been afraid to talk about. But this journal actually takes that on. This journal actually, talks about reparations. I know we only have a little bit of time left, but Patrice, I want to get your response to that, in terms of, the diversification of the nation and what does that mean, for, our audacity to talk about different things like reparations?
Yeah, well, first, I think I love the perspective of the diversification of the nation. I think that it's probably going to be used, that new census data is probably going to be used to produce fear in this now minority in white males that we're seeing, right, that the census is saying. But but I'd also say with Dr. Edozie's point around the beauty and the diversity for the Black diaspora, right? And being able to embrace that. And I'm curious as to how we really engage in our own unique diversity as a community and what that looks like for us, what that looks like to connect to our heritage, which for those of us who were born in this country, we have no real connection to, am I Nigerian? Am I Ghanaian? Or, so being able to heal that space and bring some community to that. But then as it relates to reparations, I like the local space in reparations. You have cities like, I believe, Evanston in Illinois, who's saying, well, we're going to do this program that is reflective of a reparations, right? They started this housing piece where if you are a Native Black American in Evanston and you can trace your family's history, then you get these grants for housings, right? So this is a small thing, but I like the idea that local spaces are now beginning to take on the idea of reparations.
Yeah, I mean, we should not end this discussion without talking about what I call the intramural Blackness, right? And so on the one hand we celebrate the diversity of it. On the other hand, we know that there's sometimes conflict and misunderstanding. And I just want to give two examples of the findings in our study. One is on the census, 2020 census. There was a new option to have people identify by their ethnicity, especially within the Black community. And on the one hand, that gave people like me the opportunity to identify as Nigerian American. I didn't really do that. I didn't understand why that was necessary, but a lot of Black people like to identify by their ethnicity. For good reasons, especially here in Boston. The Cape Verde are very proud of their Cape Verdean identity, but on the other hand, it is a Black identity as well. The other problem with that, though, is that in previous, political elections, the Black community has not been united, and that's the reason why we've not been able to mass up enough of our base to be able to win an election. And the problem has been that we have had Cape Verde in the past who have identified and mobilized only the Cape Verdean community and not the entire Black community. And so one lesson, in the current election is that we cannot do that. We have to come together. We're all Black, and we can celebrate our diversity within that. But it is important to understand how we need to politically come together, when we're campaigning. And so I hope it works, that we do get our first Black mayor. We have our first Black acting mayor, but we really want to see a first Black mayor.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much. We're at time now. So we're going to wrap up, but I think we've learned so much from this panel, and I want to remind everyone who's viewing now to go to the CBCF website to download the journal. It is available for free. This is the first one that we've had that was completely free, so you can take all this knowledge, compliments of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. Thank you again to our panelists. And Dr. Edozie talked about the collective identity in her article. And when we think about our connection to the world, and this world is really opening up, globalization is a thing. Any one of us now can get on social media and connect with somebody in another country. We do need to think about our collective identity and the power and the potential of the Black diaspora coming together to elevate, not just in the United States, but across the world. So thank you all so much. Desiree, you want to close us out?
Yes, thank you all so much for this impactful and engaging discussion. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our audience for joining and participating in the 50th Annual Legislative Conference. A huge thank you to Congresswoman Plaskett for engaging with this wonderful panel. And we just appreciate your thoughtful knowledge of foreign policy and financial policy and the other issues that have most certainly informed this discussion. We appreciate your perspective and of course your friendship. Thank you, Congresswoman Plaskett. To our outstanding moderator and panel, we thank you for taking this time out of your busy schedules to share your impactful research and important perspectives on issues impacting the Black diaspora. With that, I would like to thank our sponsors for supporting the annual legislative conference and just thank you for partnering with us. Thank you again for joining us for the 50th Annual Legislative Conference, Black Excellence Unparalleled, Pressing Onward in Power.